Before we even begin, it's important to set expectations. Viewer discretion is advised. This content is intended for entertainment, but it's also a study in tension, intellect, and the collision of genuine expertise with the spectacle-driven world of talk shows. What happens when someone trained to read human behavior, someone whose career revolves around observing, diagnosing, and guiding real people through complex psychological landscapes, steps into a space designed to reward surface-level commentary, provocation, and partisan spectacle? That is the question posed the moment Dr. Phil walked onto the stage of The View, a talk show that had spent years on air, diagnosing political figures from afar, often more with opinion and speculation than with evidence or formal clinical standards. Armed with actual clinical definitions, decades of experience, and a willingness to hold up a mirror that nobody asked for, Dr. Phil entered the studio with quiet confidence. He knew what was coming. He understood the environment he was stepping into: the cameras, the teleprompters, the bright lights, the applause tracks, the carefully designed set meant to create energy, engagement, and controversy in equal measure. He also understood the risk. The hosts expected validation, a professional stamp of approval for their pre-existing judgments and political biases. They assumed that his expertise would be pliable, bendable, malleable to the narrative they had already constructed over months and years. When someone trained in reading human behavior encounters hosts whose own behavior often reveals far more than their words, the dynamics shift immediately. Every facial twitch, every shift of weight, every nervous laugh or two, long pause is noticed by someone who has spent decades observing, diagnosing, and responding to subtle cues in human behavior. Dr. Phil did not come to play along. He came to educate, to correct misconceptions, and to demonstrate in real time that psychology is a science, not a political weapon. The moment the interview began, it became clear that this would not be a typical segment. A question crafted to elicit agreement, to elicit the professional validation the hosts expected, backfired spectacularly. Instead of affirming their preconceptions, Dr. Phil responded with clarity, precision, and authority. He explained, calmly but firmly, the difference between clinical diagnosis and armchair speculation. He reminded everyone watching that actual psychology requires more than watching someone on television, forming an opinion, and labeling them with a term that fits one's political narrative. What you were witnessing was more than just a talk show exchange. It was a masterclass in integrity, expertise, and the ethical practice of science under pressure. The hosts, expecting a predictable trajectory, had constructed a trap. They had anticipated a soft answer, a concise validation that would lend weight to their commentary and provide social and political ammunition. Dr. Phil, however, did not fall into the trap. He walked in knowing exactly what they wanted: a confirmation of bias, an endorsement of their existing positions, a simplification of complex psychological principles into digestible, partisan, friendly sound bites. What he gave instead was education, honesty, and a demonstration of professional rigor. From the outset, the tension was palpable. Dr. Phil's voice was calm, even, and measured, but every sentence carried weight. The hosts leaned in, eager to catch the subtle misstep that would give them leverage, that would allow them to steer the conversation back into their narrative. But there was none to be had. Each question they asked, carefully worded to bait him into agreement, was met with the precise, deliberate articulation of a professional who would not compromise the standards of his field. He explained that psychology is a science governed by ethics, observation, and rigorous methodology. It is not a political tool, a cudgel to be wielded against figures with whom one disagrees. Joy Behar, in particular, had expected a straightforward answer. She had assumed a level of pliancy, a willingness to provide the validation she had envisioned. Instead, she encountered someone with decades of experience in patient care, someone who understood the dangers of misapplied psychological terminology, someone unwilling to allow a public forum to replace proper clinical judgment. The look on her face as realization dawned, that her carefully laid trap had caught her, not her target, was priceless. It was a moment of clarity, visible to anyone watching, that illustrated the difference between opinion and expertise, between spectacle and substance. Throughout the segment, The contrast between the host's expectations and the reality of professional practice became increasingly apparent. Dr. Phil maintained control, not through aggression or spectacle, but through calm authority, subtle correction, and patient explanation. He modeled how expertise functions when it refuses to be weaponized, how integrity can prevail even in environments designed to reward provocation and controversy. For viewers, it was a rare lesson in real-world psychology, delivered on a platform usually dominated by entertainment and opinion. The segment also demonstrated the ethical responsibilities inherent in clinical practice. Dr. Phil reminded everyone, explicitly and implicitly, that proper psychological assessment requires context, direct observation, and professional interaction. Diagnosing someone based on television clips or selective behaviors is not just unscientific, it is dangerous. It is an ethical violation. Yet, in the world of talk shows, where speed, reaction, and entertainment often trump careful thought, these violations are frequent. That is why Dr. Phil's calm, unwavering approach stood out. It was a reminder that even when surrounded by cameras, applause, and political intent, science and ethics must remain intact. By the end of the segment, it was clear that the hosts had underestimated the power of professionalism, the authority of experience, and the clarity of someone unwilling to compromise integrity for spectacle. Dr. Phil did not simply answer questions. He reshaped the conversation, teaching the hosts, and by extension the audience, what it means to practice psychology responsibly. He modeled respect for the discipline, demonstrating that expertise cannot be bent to fit narratives, and that knowledge, when wielded correctly, has the power to illuminate, clarify, and educate rather than manipulate or confirm bias. This was more than television. It was a demonstration of how science can operate in public spaces, how professional knowledge maintains its value and ethical standard even under the pressure to simplify, entertain, or provoke. It was a lesson in observation, integrity, and the application of knowledge without exploitation. And for those watching, it was a reminder that expertise is not entertainment. It is rigorous, disciplined, and sometimes uncomfortable because truth often is. The segment ended, but its impact lingered. It was a moment where the audience glimpsed the difference between real psychology and partisan speculation. A moment where a seasoned professional held up a mirror to a talk show built on performance and expectation, reflecting not just what they wanted to see, but what they needed to understand. Dr. Phil left the stage knowing that he had not been a guest, not merely a performer. He had been an educator, a guardian of his discipline, and a reminder that expertise is not optional, even in a world driven by spectacle. And for anyone who had tuned in expecting validation, applause, or a viral soundbite, the lesson was clear. Real knowledge does not bend to expectation. Real expertise cannot be weaponized without consequence. What unfolded that day on The View was a masterclass in integrity, ethics, and professionalism, a rare, unforgettable demonstration of how science and experience stand firm, even under the glare of lights, cameras, and the pressure to entertain. And what happens when someone finally calls out the armchair diagnosticians who have spent years on television playing doctor for ratings, applause, and clicks? When someone trained in the science of human behavior confronts the spectacle-driven narrative that so many rely on to entertain, provoke, and sometimes mislead. That morning, the View studio hummed with its familiar, electric energy, a combination of anticipation, routine, and just enough chaos to make everything feel spontaneous. The hosts moved with the practiced ease of people who had performed this dance countless times before. Every gesture, every pause, every facial expression had been refined over thousands of episodes. They settled into their chairs with a comfortable confidence, knowing the cameras, the teleprompters, the lighting, the sound, all of it would follow the preordained rhythm. Their topic, carefully chosen to appeal to their demographic, had been predetermined. The narrative arc, like the storyboard of a film, had been mapped out in advance. The beats were choreographed to elicit exactly the response they wanted from the audience: laughter, gasps, moral outrage, or affirmation of their pre-existing beliefs. Political commentary was wrapped in the language of concern. Partisan attacks were carefully disguised as legitimate questions. Every word, every inflection, every well-timed pause had been engineered to create the illusion of inquiry while delivering precisely the messages the hosts had been repeating for years. It was in many ways a performance, one in which the audience was complicit, conditioned to expect the rhythm and cadence of partisan critique masquerading as reasoned dialogue. Across from them sat Dr. Phil, a man whose presence was a study in contrast. He carried himself with the relaxed authority of someone who had been in front of cameras for decades, who had navigated countless interviews, who understood media dynamics but was never fully controlled by them. His body language spoke volumes, shoulders squared but relaxed, hands resting lightly, eyes steady and observant, every small motion deliberate, measured, intentional. There was a certain rhythm to his presence, a cadence that combined Southern charm with professional expertise, a mix of warmth, approachability, and quiet command that immediately demanded respect without needing to assert dominance. He had spent a career treating patients, analyzing behavior with precision, and navigating ethical boundaries that few in the entertainment world even acknowledged. The conversation flowed through a series of neutral topics at first, a gradual build-up that seemed innocuous. They discussed the new film Dr. Phil was promoting, the dynamics of storytelling, and the subtle lessons one could draw from fiction. It was all calm, polished, the sort of exchange that could have ended with smiles, applause, and a seamless cut to commercial. But underneath the surface the tension was palpable. Joy Behar in particular had been preparing for a moment she believed would secure her professional triumph. She had spent the morning doing her research, crafting her question, constructing what she thought was an airtight setup. In her mind, she had devised a trap that would allow Dr. Phil to confirm everything The View had been claiming for years about their favorite political target. This was supposed to be validation, a professional endorsement of positions they had already committed to, a stamp of approval from a figure whose authority and experience could not easily be questioned. But Joy had made a critical miscalculation. She assumed that Dr. Phil would prioritize being a good guest over being a good psychologist. She assumed that he would bend to the expectations of television production, to the allure of ratings, to the applause of the crowd. She had forgotten, or perhaps never fully grasped, that some people's professional integrity matters more than television appearances, more than audience approval, more than any viral moment. And in that studio, on that day, she was about to learn that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. So, with a tone meant to convey cleverness, authority, and control, Joy began. The cadence of her voice carried that peculiar mix of selfish boredness and subtle triumph, the kind of tone someone uses when they believe they are about to score a win on live television. "You can't diagnose anybody from afar," she said, her eyes bright, her smile carefully calibrated. "Doctors, therapists, professional clinicians, but a lot of respected psychologists out there, really big-time big names, are saying that Donald Trump is showing signs of narcissism." She paused deliberately, allowing her words to hang in the air, clearly believing that she had framed her question perfectly, sculpted every syllable to deliver the maximum effect. She continued, leaning slightly forward, as if to impart the weight of her expertise onto the television audience. "One of the symptoms is being preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power, success, and brilliance, and they're questioning whether he has narcissistic disorder. Number one, do you think that's a mental illness, narcissism, and if so, is he fit to be president?" The setup was flawless in her mind. The audience, trained to anticipate conflict and confirmation, leaned in. Cameras lingered, ready to capture his response. But Dr. Phil did not respond the way Joy had envisioned. There was no immediate concession, no soft agreement, no nod toward partisan expectation. Instead, he maintained his calm, measured demeanor, eyes steady, posture relaxed, voice low but authoritative. He had been here before, countless times, and he understood the traps, the expectations, the subtle pressure of being placed under a microscope for the sake of entertainment. What followed was not just a rebuttal, it was a masterclass in professional integrity. Dr. Phil explained, calmly and clearly, that diagnosing someone requires direct clinical interaction, observation, and comprehensive evaluation. You cannot make a legitimate psychological assessment based on television appearances, sound bites, or public persona. He emphasized the ethical responsibility of professionals to avoid speculation in public forums, noting that reducing complex psychological conditions to political commentary is not only unscientific, but potentially harmful. Joy's carefully constructed moment unraveled before her eyes. Every subtle inflection, every careful pause she had time to elicit agreement, failed to yield the expected response. The trap she had built, the intellectual snare designed to secure validation, caught only her. Her face betrayed a flicker of realization. This was not a performance she could control, not a guest she could manipulate. Dr. Phil's professionalism, his refusal to compromise, and his clarity of expertise overpowered the narrative she had intended to control. The audience, many of whom had tuned in expecting a predictable partisan volley, were treated instead to an authentic lesson in psychological ethics, critical thinking, and the difference between observation and speculation. Dr. Phil had demonstrated, in real time, the proper application of expertise, the value of professional integrity, and the responsibility of clinicians to remain truthful, objective, and ethical, even when under pressure to conform to the expectations of television spectacle. It was a moment that transcended political affiliation. It was a moment in which the audience witnessed the collision of real expertise with the artifice of performance, the integrity of a professional refusing to compromise, and the folly of assuming that authority can be weaponized for validation. The lesson was clear. Knowledge is not entertainment, expertise is not a tool for partisan gain, and integrity cannot be borrowed for ratings without consequence. In that live segment, the contrast between expectation and reality was stark. Dr. Phil had not come to play along, he had come to educate. He had reminded the hosts, the audience, and anyone watching at home that psychology is a science, not a political weapon. That ethical practice matters more than applause, that expertise carries responsibility, and that professional integrity cannot be substituted with clever phrasing or a setup designed for theatrical effect. What unfolded that day was not just television. It was a demonstration of authority, ethics, and mastery in action. It was a reminder that some professionals, those who have dedicated decades to their craft, cannot be manipulated into service for spectacle. And it was a rare, unforgettable lesson in how true expertise operates under pressure, how knowledge maintains its standards even when challenged, and how ethical clarity can illuminate a room even when expectations are entirely contrary. By the end of that segment, it was evident. Joy Behar had miscalculated, the audience had learned, and Dr. Phil had delivered a lesson in professional integrity, restraint, and ethical application of knowledge that would not soon be forgotten. It was television as education, spectacle as instruction, and a rare glimpse of truth piercing the fog of partisanship. The question hung in the air like a charged wire, thick with assumptions and loaded with intent. It was not just a question, it was a carefully constructed trap, designed to elicit a predetermined answer. Every syllable, every inflection, every pause had been strategically orchestrated to guide the conversation along a path that would validate preconceived notions. The hosts had rehearsed it, believed in it, and assumed that the expert sitting across from them would follow the script they had in mind. They were counting on a simple affirmation, a nod of agreement, a professional stamp of approval that would allow their audience to cheer, share, and retweet without a moment's doubt. But Dr. Phil had been doing this far too long to fall for such a transparent setup. His career had been built on navigating both the technical and performative aspects of public communication. He had spent decades observing human behavior, diagnosing patients, and teaching lessons that mattered in real life, far beyond the glow of television cameras and the applause of a studio audience. He understood the mechanics of live television, the timing, the framing, the energy of expectation, but he also understood boundaries, ethics, and the difference between being a professional and being a performer. He leaned slightly forward, a subtle but deliberate motion, and began to speak. "Well, Counselor Doctor," Phil said, his voice smooth, calm, carrying a faint trace of amusement at the transparent setup he had just been presented. "That's a compound question, and I object." There was laughter in the studio, light, polite, from an audience conditioned to expect quick, humorous acknowledgement in response to every verbal jab. But Dr. Phil was not making a joke. Every word, every pause, every intonation was calculated, precise, and intentional. He was already establishing a principle. He would not be manipulated into providing answers that aligned with preconceived conclusions. He was a psychologist, not a political operative, and he was about to demonstrate the difference between expertise and spectacle. The distinction was subtle but powerful. One demanded rigor, ethical integrity, and adherence to standards. The other demanded applause, virality, and immediate gratification. The room itself seemed to sense the shift in energy. The laughter faded slightly as the audience recognized the seriousness beneath the calm tone. This was no ordinary interview. This was a lesson in professional ethics, played out under the glaring lights of a talk show studio. "You know, Doctor," Phil continued, shifting into his measured rhythm, "people talk about narcissism a lot, but they don't really know what it means. They throw the word around casually, as if understanding the term required no context, no study, no grounding in clinical standards. So, I brought a list from the DSM-5 about what narcissism really is, because if I asked people to stand up and define it, they wouldn't know." Already, the segment was veering off script. Joy Behar had anticipated validation, a professional nod that would reinforce her point of view, a confirmation of her belief that the political figure they had been critiquing for years displayed signs of mental illness. She had expected Dr. Phil to comply with the social and political rhythm of the show, to become another instrument in the performance of partisan commentary. Instead, he was preparing to give a genuine psychology lesson, rooted in the diagnostic manual that professionals actually use, grounded in years of study, observation, and ethical practice. Dr. Phil adjusted the papers in front of him, methodical, precise, and began to read. "Let's just take a look," he said, scanning the notes, his voice calm but authoritative. "One has a grandiose sense of self-importance." His gaze lifted briefly, scanning the audience, scanning the hosts, but his tone remained neutral, clinical, without judgment or political color. Before he could continue, Joy leaned forward eagerly, a flash of triumph in her expression. "Check," she interjected. It was the reaction she had been waiting for, the affirmation that would validate her question, and by extension, the framing she had spent so much effort constructing. Dr. Phil's eyes flicked toward her for a moment, not with irritation, but with awareness of her expectation. He returned to the list, too, is preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, or brilliance. He continued. Joy's excitement grew. She spoke again, practically beaming. "Check." Her delight was palpable. She clearly believed that Dr. Phil's methodical reading of the DSM-5 was confirmation of her diagnosis. The professional authority of Dr. Phil, in her mind, had finally aligned with her own expectations. She smiled, certain that the question she had framed so carefully had landed exactly as she had intended. But Dr. Phil, in that moment, was not playing along. The lesson he was teaching, the subtle but unmissable distinction between casual observation and clinical diagnosis, was unfolding before the entire studio. The audience, initially leaning forward for the drama and spectacle, began to sense the gravity of what was happening. This was not partisan theater. This was a real demonstration of scientific rigor, ethical clarity, and the disciplined application of knowledge. As he continued down the list, explaining each criterion, the subtext became undeniable. Professional psychology cannot be condensed into sound bites. Ethical assessment cannot be bent to fit partisan narratives. The tools, definitions, and standards of the field exist to protect people, to clarify behavior, and to provide actionable insight, not to score political points or validate existing biases. Each item on the list was a small, deliberate affirmation of methodology, of process, of careful, principled work. Joy's excitement, at first unchecked, began to encounter subtle friction. Each subsequent item, Dr. Phil Reed was accompanied not by confirmation, but by context, nuance, and clarification. Her assumptions that expertise could be borrowed, wielded, or manipulated were being dismantled in real time. The audience, the hosts, and even the production crew were witnessing an expert refusing to be a tool for entertainment, refusing to bend integrity to convenience, refusing to substitute authority for compliance. By the end of that segment, the effect was clear. What had been intended as a moment of partisan validation had transformed into a lesson in professional responsibility. Dr. Phil had not simply answered a question. He had illustrated the difference between knowledge and opinion, between science and theater, between genuine expertise and the illusion of authority crafted for applause. Every observer in that room, from the hosts to the cameras to the audience at home, had received a front-row demonstration of ethics, rigor, and integrity in action. And in that moment, the lesson became unmistakable. True expertise cannot be commanded, manipulated, or reduced to entertainment. It demands attention, respect, and adherence to principle. Dr. Phil had not only avoided the trap, but had turned it into a teaching opportunity. His calm, measured, methodical approach had demonstrated that professional judgment operates independently of expectation, and that knowledge, when applied with integrity, speaks louder than spectacle ever could. By the time the segment concluded, it was evident that the dynamics of the show had shifted. Joy Behar's carefully planned question had failed to secure the outcome she intended. The audience had been educated, enlightened, and subtly challenged to reconsider the difference between opinion and expertise. Dr. Phil had reminded everyone present that ethical practice, grounded in evidence and methodology, cannot be co-opted by theatrics or partisanship. It was television transformed into a classroom, a moment where authority and integrity illuminated a space otherwise designed for spectacle. A reminder, broadcast to millions, that real knowledge demands rigor, that professional integrity matters, and that expertise, when wielded correctly, cannot be weaponized without consequence. In short, it was a masterclass in psychology, ethics, and communication, all unfolding under the bright, unforgiving lights of daytime television.